the ocean was never still. Even on calm days, the deck of a carrier seemed to breathe, rising and falling, pitching with every slow pulse of the sea. For Navy pilots in the 1940s and 1950s, that moving deck was both a home and a trap. The difference between a perfect landing and disaster could be a fraction of a second, a gust of wind, or a single misjudged angle. Yet these men kept doing it over and over, turning metal decks into the busiest, most dangerous runways in the world. Before the revolution of landing backwards began, carrier aviation was defined by chaos and courage. Planes approached the ship straight ahead, from the same direction it was moving, landing with the carrier's forward motion, not against it. It seemed logical. The ship's speed added lift to the incoming aircraft, shortening the approach time. But logic and safety rarely coexisted at sea. The faster the carrier moved, the greater the turbulence along its deck, and the harder it became for pilots to judge distance and line up with the small rectangular landing area. In the Second World War, American carriers were the spearheads of naval power. The Pacific was a floating battlefield, from Midway to Leyte Gulf, where squadrons of Wildcats, Hellcats, and Avengers turned the tide of history. But carrier operations came at a cost. Landing accidents were frequent and brutal. Deck crews stood just meters away from spinning propellers and tailhooks that could snap without warning. If a pilot came in too high, he missed all the arresting wires and slammed into the barriers. Too low, and his tail would catch the edge of the deck, tearing the aircraft apart. Every man on those decks knew someone who didn't make it. In 1945, even with experience and improved training, nearly 1 in 5 carrier aircraft accidents occurred during landing. Some planes never even made it to the barrier. They would crash into parked aircraft or slide across the deck into the sea. The statistics were grim, but there was no alternative. If carriers were to dominate global warfare, they needed to evolve. The first hints of change came not from the United States, but from across the Atlantic. After the war, the Royal Navy faced the same deadly problem. Their new generation of jet aircraft was faster, heavier, and far less forgiving than the piston-engine planes of the war years. Jets approached the deck at nearly double the speed, leaving almost no margin for error. The British realized that the old straight-deck carriers, designed for the slower days of propeller aviation, were dangerously outdated. In 1951, a quiet revolution began on the decks of HMS Triumph and HMS Centaur. Engineers and pilots, led by Captain Dennis Campbell and the brilliant designer Louis Boddington, proposed something radical. Instead of landing straight down the centerline of the carrier, what if pilots landed at an angle, slightly across the deck, so that they were not heading directly toward the parked aircraft at the bow? It sounded almost absurd at first, even reckless. But this was the seed of the idea that would change naval aviation forever. The concept became known as the angled flight deck. By turning the landing area several degrees off the ship's centerline, usually between 8 and 9 degrees, a new geometry emerged. Pilots who missed the arresting wires could now safely throttle up and take off again, instead of smashing into aircraft parked ahead. In essence, they would be landing backwards relative to the traditional direction of the carrier's motion. The British Navy tested the theory with chalk lines, temporary markings, and early prototypes. To their surprise, it worked. The first trials showed that even minor adjustments in deck angle dramatically reduced accident rates. Landing signal officers found it easier to guide planes. Pilots had better visibility of the landing path. The angled deck allowed for simultaneous takeoff and landing operations, a feat that was impossible before. For the first time, the chaotic ballet of carrier aviation began to resemble an orchestrated system. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy was watching. American engineers at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, had already begun experimenting with the concept after seeing the British results. By 1952, the USS Midway and USS Antietam became the first U.S. carriers to test the angled deck modification. The impact was immediate. On November 12, 1952, Test Pilot Commander J.L. Willie Callahan made the first angled deck landing aboard Antietam. The flight was smooth, controlled, almost effortless compared to the tense straight-deck approaches of the past. Callahan described the experience as, "The first time I felt the ship was helping me land, not fighting me." This new method, in which the ship's deck effectively moved away from the incoming aircraft, gave pilots the psychological and physical margin they needed. It was, in every sense, landing backwards. Instead of chasing the ship's movement, pilots approached against it, using the relative motion to stabilize descent and allow for a go-around if something went wrong. Soon, accident rates dropped by more than 50%. Carrier commanders realized that with angled decks, they could launch one aircraft while recovering another. The entire rhythm of naval warfare changed. What once took minutes between launch and recovery cycles now happened almost continuously. For every hour of operation, a modern carrier could put twice as many planes in the air as before. Strike power, the very currency of carrier dominance, had effectively doubled. But technology was not just about the deck angle. Around the same time, two other inventions reshaped carrier aviation: the steam catapult and the optical landing system. The steam catapult, developed by British engineer Commander C.C. Mitchell, replaced the old hydraulic systems that struggled to launch heavy jets. With a controlled burst of steam pressure, even the largest jet fighters could be hurled from the deck with astonishing precision. The optical landing system, or meatball, gave pilots a visual reference for their glide path. A glowing orange light moved within a set of reference bars. If the ball was high, the pilot was above the correct descent angle. If it dropped low, the pilot was in danger of undershooting. For the first time, aviators had a real-time visual aid that worked in any weather. Combined with the angled deck, it made carrier landings exponentially safer and more efficient. By the mid-1950s, the transformation was complete. Every major U.S. carrier had been converted or built with an angled deck. The world's seas echoed with the thunder of jet engines as the new generation of naval aircraft, F-9F Cougars, F-J Furus, and later the F-8 Crusaders, streaked toward their floating runways. What had once been a desperate challenge became a refined art, a dance of precision and confidence. And yet, behind the steel and technology, the human spirit remained unchanged. Pilots still felt that familiar mix of fear and pride as they approached the carrier, that moment when the ocean filled the windshield and the deck lights flickered in the night. The backwards landing didn't remove the danger, it gave pilots a fighting chance. Old veterans who had flown during World War II watched in awe. They remembered the wooden decks of the Enterprise, the smell of fuel and cordite, the endless Pacific horizon. For them, this new era of aviation was almost miraculous, proof that their sacrifices had paved the way for something safer, smarter, and stronger. The angled deck became more than a structural innovation. It became a symbol of human adaptation, the way courage and intellect combine to overcome nature's chaos. In the age of jets and nuclear carriers, the principle remained unchanged. The ocean would always fight back, but mankind would always find a way to land. The years following the first successful angled deck landings were a turning point not only for naval engineering but for the very psychology of carrier pilots. Before this innovation, men who flew from carriers lived with a constant, intimate awareness of death. Every mission ended with a knife edge of uncertainty. Would the plane stop in time? Would the arresting wire hold? Would the deck be clear? The angled deck did not erase the danger, but it changed its nature. For the first time, pilots could go around, recover, and try again. That simple option, to live another attempt, transformed the culture of carrier aviation. By 1954, the U.S. Navy had already begun converting older carriers to test the new system. Antietam's trials had been so successful that shipyards from Norfolk to Bremerton started cutting into flight decks, adding the now distinctive portside extensions. The transformation was not merely mechanical. It represented a philosophical shift, a rare admission that centuries of naval tradition could be improved by geometry and courage to experiment. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued a report calling the angled deck the most significant development in the history of carrier aviation since the introduction of the arresting hook. Admiral Arleigh Burke, then Chief of Naval Operations, recognized its potential immediately. His directive was simple: future carriers would all be built this way. The United States had witnessed the birth of a new doctrine, one that would define the Cold War at sea. In the skies, technology was advancing at an equally unstoppable pace. Jets like the F-9 Cougar, the F-3 Demon, and later the F-8 Crusader could reach speeds previously unthinkable from carrier decks. But these machines required space, precision, and margin, three things the old straight-deck carriers could not provide. The angled deck conversion allowed these jets to operate safely, giving the Navy the flexibility to deploy supersonic fighters and heavy attack bombers from the same platform. Each landing became a demonstration of physics and nerve. The pilot lined up several miles behind the ship, descending through crosswinds and turbulence, eyes fixed on the oscillating deck ahead. At 140 knots, every heartbeat mattered. The landing signal officer stood on the port side, orange paddles in hand, or later, his gaze locked on the glowing optical system, the meatball. He would speak calmly into the radio, guiding each aviator with precise corrections. On glide, power, a little low, hold it. But beneath that calm radio voice was the collective memory of decades of trial and loss. Carrier aviation had been born in an era when even small mistakes meant catastrophe. Now, with the angled deck, the pilots carried the ghosts of those who came before. Every correction, every technique honed by men who had once risked their lives on wooden decks lit by oil lamps. As the Cold War intensified, carrier strike groups became floating cities of readiness. The U.S. Navy's new supercarriers, Forrestal, Saratoga, Ranger, and Independence, emerged from the shipyards in the late 1950s, each with vast angled decks, steam catapults, and optical landing systems integrated from keel to island. These ships embodied a nation's will to project power anywhere on Earth. To the public, the change was subtle, just a tilt of the deck. But to the men who lived it, it was the difference between terror and trust. The backwards landing technique, as some jokingly called it, turned a lethal routine into a controlled process. It doubled sortie rates, allowing carriers to maintain a constant rotation of fighters in the air. During fleet exercises in the Atlantic and Pacific, U.S. carriers demonstrated that they could launch and recover aircraft every few minutes, keeping an uninterrupted screen of combat air patrol over the fleet. Behind every landing was a choreography of machines and men. Deck crews in color-coded jerseys, yellow for directors, green for catapult and arresting gear, red for ordnance, blue for plane handlers, brown for crew chiefs, and white for safety officers, moved in perfect synchronization. On the angled deck they had more space, more visibility, and less chaos. The design itself protected them. Aircraft that missed wires no longer barreled toward the forward parking area. For the first time, safety and efficiency grew together. The British Royal Navy continued to refine the concept. Their carrier Ark Royal featured a 8.5-degree deck angle, and soon the Americans pushed theirs to 9 or 10 degrees, optimizing for wind and ship speed. The results were astonishing. In simulations and live trials, the recovery interval between aircraft dropped from 90 seconds to under 45. For a strike group launching dozens of sorties per hour, that meant twice the combat presence, twice the ability to deliver ordnance, defend the fleet, or provide reconnaissance. The effect was immediate in every theater. In the late 1950s, as tensions flared in Korea's aftermath and the Cold War deepened, U.S. carriers became symbols of deterrence. When the USS Midway steamed into the South China Sea, her angled deck gleamed like an arrow against the horizon, a silent message that American air power could appear anywhere, anytime. The Soviet Union took notice. In their design bureaus, engineers began studying the concept, eventually adapting it for their own carriers decades later. But while geopolitics shifted, for the pilots the experience remained deeply personal. Each approach began miles out, where sea and sky merged into a trembling gray line. Through the canopy, the pilot could see the long wake of the carrier stretching into infinity. The deck seemed impossibly small, just 700 feet of moving steel. Yet something new had changed the emotion of that moment. Before the angled deck, fear was a silent companion. Afterward, it was replaced by focus. The landing zone, offset from the ship's bow, appeared to stand still against the horizon, a target that could be trusted. When Commander George Duncan performed one of the first jet landings on an angled deck during early tests, he remarked afterward that it felt like the sea had stopped trying to kill us. That sentiment spread quickly. Every veteran who had fought through World War II understood what he meant. They had watched friends vanish into the ocean, had heard the scream of a wire snapping, had felt decks shudder beneath failed recoveries. The new system brought peace of mind, a fragile peace built on engineering and sacrifice. By 1960, the angled deck was not just standard, it was doctrine. Every carrier fleet in the Western world used it. The U.S. Navy's training manuals rewrote their procedures, emphasizing go-around capability, optical landing cues, and the integration of jet dynamics with deck movement. The combination of steam catapult and angled deck made the aircraft carrier the most complex moving airfield in human history, a 90,000-ton machine synchronized to the heartbeat of the ocean. And still, the human element remained central. The engineers who had envisioned it, Campbell, Boddington, Mitchell, and dozens of unnamed draftsmen, rarely saw the sea. Yet their designs carried generations of aviators safely home. Veterans of the Pacific War visited new carriers during commissioning ceremonies, standing silently on the steel that replaced the wooden decks of their youth. Many wept. They saw in those angled lines not just innovation but redemption, proof that lessons written in blood had not been forgotten. During the Vietnam War, the full power of the system was tested. In the humid air of the Gulf of Tonkin, carrier flight operations ran around the clock. Jets roared off the bow while others descended toward the angled deck, their landing lights cutting through monsoon mist. The rhythm was relentless. Launch, recover, refuel, rearm, launch again. The angled deck made this tempo possible. Without it, the sheer volume of missions, sometimes over 150 sorties per day from a single carrier, would have been unthinkable. Pilots spoke of the trust they placed in that slanted stretch of metal. Many had fathers who'd flown during World War II. They knew the history, the crashes, the losses, the courage. They carried that memory with them each time they lined up the meatball and watched it glide between the datum lights. When they trapped the third wire and felt the jolt of deceleration, they weren't just landing an aircraft. They were landing history itself. In the ready rooms, where the smell of coffee and jet fuel mingled, the old photographs hung on the walls, sepia images of men in leather flight helmets standing on flat, narrow decks without angles or catapults. Young aviators would look at them before missions and realize how much had changed. The angled deck was more than steel geometry. It was a quiet memorial, a constant reminder that progress is built upon remembrance. To the outside world, naval aviation seemed like a triumph of technology, but to those who lived it, it was a triumph of adaptation. Each modification, from the optical landing system to the reinforced arresting gear, came from observation, from mistakes studied without ego. The engineers had not reinvented flight, they had reinvented survival. In archival footage from the early 1960s, one can see the evolution in motion. Sleek jets slicing through ocean spray, tailhooks sparking on steel, arresting cables snapping taut in the night. The decks glowed with sodium lights, and the angled approach turned what once was chaos into rhythm. Historians later wrote that this was the moment the aircraft carrier became not just a ship, but a concept, a symbol of human control over the elements. For those who had endured the old straight decks, the sight was almost spiritual. Many of them, now retired, would gather at reunions watching the newsreels of new carriers with angled decks launching phantom jets and skyhawks. They would nod silently, eyes misting. The danger was still there, the sea never forgave, but man had learned to dance with it rather than fight it. By the end of the decade, the term backwards landing had disappeared from official vocabulary, replaced by the clinical, angled approach. Yet among pilots, the older phrase survived as a badge of pride. It reminded them that every improvement carried a story of risk, trial, and transformation. The sea was still vast, the deck still small, but now there was room for grace. By the dawn of the 1960s, the angled deck carrier had become the beating heart of American strategy. The United States no longer measured its power by how many bombers it could launch from land, but by how many squadrons it could deploy from the sea. Every ocean became a potential runway, every horizon a frontier of deterrence. The Cold War was not defined only by ideology, it was defined by readiness. Nuclear weapons, long-range missiles, and submarine fleets all played their part, but nothing embodied the posture of constant vigilance like a carrier deck under the stars, engines idling, crew at their stations. The angled deck turned those floating airfields into self-contained strike platforms, capable of projecting power within minutes. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962, that design philosophy was tested in the most dangerous week of the century. Carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Independence took up positions in the Caribbean, their decks alive with motion day and night. Pilots sat strapped into cockpits as radar operators scanned for Soviet signatures. The new system of backwards landings allowed for an operational tempo that no other navy could match. Jets launched, patrolled, and recovered in overlapping cycles, a dance of readiness that kept the fleet's striking edge constantly honed. Observers in Washington later noted that without the angled deck carriers, the U.S. Navy could not have sustained the surveillance and patrol density required during those tense days. What had begun as a geometric adjustment had evolved into a doctrine of persistence. Each landing, each takeoff, each controlled go-around represented a link in the chain of global stability. For the sailors below decks, life revolved around that rhythm. The roar of turbines, the thud of arresting cables, the vibration that ran through every bulkhead, it was the sound of deterrence itself. On the mess decks, young airmen listened to the older ones describe how things had been back then, when landing meant gambling with luck and weather. The new generation had grown up under the angled deck. They respected it but no longer feared it. Their fathers had fought the war that taught the lessons. They were now the heirs to its wisdom. In shipyards, engineers continued to refine the system. The angle increased slightly, deck markings became more standardized. Arresting wires were redesigned with better shock absorption, and flight deck materials evolved from painted steel to heat-resistant non-skid surfaces. Each detail, each line of white paint, carried decades of accumulated experience. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, observing from afar, began its own experiments. Though its early carriers were hybrids of cruiser and flight deck, the principle was unmistakable. By the 1970s, even Soviet designers had adopted the angled approach, acknowledging its undeniable efficiency. It was one of those rare moments in military history when engineering transcended politics. The sea, indifferent to ideology, rewarded only what worked. For the pilots, the change went beyond mechanics. It shaped identity. The angled deck demanded precision, a perfect balance of speed, descent rate, and alignment. It punished hesitation and rewarded discipline. To trap the wire cleanly was an art form, a signature of skill. The best pilots were those who could read the deck as if it were alive, anticipating its heave and roll. Many veterans described it as a conversation with the ocean, a dialogue without words. Night landings became the ultimate test. In the darkness, the optical landing system was the only guide, its amber light pulsing in the black void. The pilot flew not toward a runway but toward a moving patch of light. In that moment there was no horizon, only trust. In training, in the crew below, in the steel geometry that made it possible. Those who had flown piston aircraft during World War II marveled at this evolution. They remembered the wooden decks of the Hornet and the Yorktown, the smell of gasoline, the scream of propellers. Now, jets descended with the precision of guided instruments, their pilots trained not only in courage but in calculation. The Navy's strike doctrine evolved accordingly. With the angled deck, carriers could launch attack waves in quick succession and recover returning aircraft simultaneously. This doubled strike power was not merely theoretical, it reshaped warfare itself. During Vietnam, operations like Rolling Thunder and Linebacker II depended on the ability to generate massive sortie counts in compressed timeframes. Carrier groups maintained continuous presence off the Vietnamese coast for months, their flight decks glowing through tropical storms and monsoon rains. Historians later calculated that the sortie rate per carrier during those years was nearly twice what similar ships could have achieved with straight decks. Every mission, every bomb delivered, every reconnaissance photograph taken owed its existence to that slanted innovation first tested on the Antietam. For the men who worked those decks, the human cost was still high. The sea remained unforgiving. Arresting cables could snap, engines could fail, and fire was always one spark away. Yet the statistics told a new story. Survival rates had improved dramatically. The deck crews, often overlooked in grand narratives, found themselves part of a machine that finally respected their safety as much as its mission. The angled deck had created lanes of predictability, corridors where chaos once ruled. In those years, carrier operations became a symbol of modernity itself, the union of courage and computation. Computers began to assist with launch timing, navigation, and flight path prediction. But even as technology advanced, the essence of the experience remained ancient, men meeting the sea on its own terms. Old veterans, now gray-haired, would gather on the pier whenever a new carrier returned from deployment. They would watch the younger generation disembark, laughing, tired, unscarred. Many of those elders had buried friends whose aircraft had missed the old barriers or caught fire on landing. They would look up at the ship's massive angled deck and whisper that it was the smartest thing man ever did with a flat piece of steel. In the archives, footage captured the poetry of the new age, a phantom jet emerging from the mist, its tailhook sparking as it caught the third wire, deck crews rushing forward in perfect choreography, a launch officer saluting as another jet catapulted into the air. The camera panned across the deck's angled geometry, where order had replaced peril. For those who had lived through the Second World War, These images stirred more than pride. They evoked wonder. The same generation that had once fought with machine guns and propellers now saw humanity mastering the physics of flight upon a moving ocean. Many could not believe how far they had come in so few decades. By the 1970s, the angled deck was no longer a novelty. It was an expectation. Every new design, from the nuclear-powered Enterprise to the Nimitz-class giants, carried it as a core element. These ships became floating continents, capable of launching jet aircraft heavier than entire squadrons of World War II planes combined. The deck's slant, a subtle visual detail to outsiders, was the key to this entire ecosystem. Naval architects spoke of it in reverent tones. They understood that the angled deck had solved not one problem but a chain of them: safety, efficiency, sortie generation, deck management. It was a rare engineering solution that improved every variable at once. When the Nimitz class entered service in 1975, it embodied that legacy, a ship where every rivet and every radar pulse owed its logic to that single decision made decades earlier on the gray decks of the HMS Triumph. In documentaries of the time, narrators described the sight of night operations aboard these carriers. The sea black as oil, the deck a glowing river of lights, and jets streaming like meteors into the sky. Each landing was a controlled fall toward a moving target, each success a small miracle repeated hundreds of times a day. To those who listened, the veterans in quiet living rooms, the widows who remembered telegrams from another era, these scenes carried a profound emotional weight. They could hear echoes of the past in the roar of those engines, could see the shadows of their youth in the bright helmets of the new generation. The technology might have changed, but the courage was timeless. As the Cold War stretched into the 1980s, carrier operations became a continuous ballet of motion. Nuclear propulsion freed the ships from refueling, and with the angled deck there was almost no downtime. Strike groups could sustain presence indefinitely, projecting calm strength in turbulent waters, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, from the North Atlantic to the South China Sea. Each landing was a conversation between eras. The young pilot touching down on an angled deck in 1982 might not have known the names of Campbell or Boddington, might never have heard of Antietam, but his survival traced directly back to them. The veterans watching from shore understood that lineage. They knew that behind every innovation lay stories of those who had paid for it in blood and salt water. By the early 1980s, the angled deck was no longer just a feature of naval design, it was a philosophy of control. It represented the perfect fusion of engineering, discipline, and adaptation to chaos. Every Navy pilot who trained to land on a carrier understood that they were taking part in an unbroken tradition of mastery over the sea. The ocean never changed. Its waves still rose and fell with the same indifferent rhythm. But mankind's response had evolved from endurance to elegance. During the Cold War's final decades, the U.S. Navy operated with a confidence unseen in any previous era. The Nimitz-class supercarriers, enormous nuclear-powered vessels with decks longer than 3 football fields, embodied the height of human engineering. Each one could carry up to 90 aircraft, sustain operations indefinitely, and project air power across any ocean. Yet their efficiency, their rhythm, their very safety, all traced back to that single idea: the angled landing pattern that allowed pilots to approach backwards, against the motion of the ship. On these giants, flight operations ran continuously. In the Persian Gulf, in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, carrier task forces rotated deployments as symbols of presence and reassurance. The sight of a U.S. carrier at sea became a kind of diplomacy in itself, a message of calm strength. Diplomats could speak in words, carriers spoke in movement. And that movement relied entirely on precision. The endless loop of launches and recoveries, the symphony of machinery and courage, the thousands of people who made it possible. Veterans of World War II often visited these ships, walking the broad steel decks that replaced the narrow wooden planks of their youth. Some were stunned into silence. Where once they had faced the screaming chaos of propeller engines and smoke, they now saw a world of discipline, of order, of mathematics applied to danger. The angled deck, glowing beneath their feet, seemed to them like a monument, a simple geometric tilt that had rewritten the rules of survival. They remembered what it had been like before: the fear of the straight approach, the helpless seconds after missing a wire, the sudden impact into parked aircraft. They had watched friends die doing what these new pilots now performed hundreds of times a day. To them it was as if the sea itself had been tamed, not by force but by intellect. In training programs, Instructors reminded young aviators of this legacy. Every Navy pilot learned the history of the angled deck before his first carrier qualification. It was not presented as trivia but as a lesson in humility. The students were told that each landing they made safely was a gift of the past, a debt owed to those who had crashed and burned so that others might improve. By the late 1980s, computer-assisted landing systems began to augment human judgment. Instruments could now measure descent rate, airspeed, and deck motion in real time, feeding data into onboard displays. But despite all technological progress, one element never changed. The final decision remained with the pilot. No machine could feel the subtle rhythm of the deck or sense the ocean's mood. The angled deck was more than a structure. It was a partnership between man, machine, and sea. When the Cold War ended in 1991, some wondered whether such enormous carriers were still necessary. But history had its own answer. In every crisis that followed, the Persian Gulf, the Balkans, the Indian Ocean, carriers remained the first responders of power projection. They carried the legacy of that one geometric innovation into a new century. During Operation Desert Storm, F/A-18 Hornets and A-6 Intruders launched from the USS Saratoga and USS Ranger in endless waves. Each recovery followed the same choreography perfected over 40 years earlier. A descending glide path at 3 degrees, the meatball centered in the pilot's vision, the deck angled to the port side, the arresting wire waiting like a handshake. Pilots landing at night over the black expanse of the Arabian Sea described the same pulse of awe their predecessors had felt in 1952. Technology had changed, but the sensation had not. It was in those moments that history folded back on itself. The sound of a modern jet arresting on steel echoed the crash of propellers on wooden decks decades before. The smell of burnt rubber, the jolt of the hook catching the wire, all of it carried memories of a time when every landing had been a roll of the dice. Now that same act was routine yet never ordinary. In museums and memorials across the world, retired sailors told visitors about the transformation. They would point to models of old straight-deck carriers, explaining how pilots once had no room for error, and then to the angled decks of modern ships, explaining how a few degrees of innovation had doubled efficiency and halved fear. Many could not speak of it without emotion. For them, it was proof that progress could be moral, that technology could redeem suffering. Through the 1990s, the U.S. Navy refined the process further. Digital flight data recorders, automatic carrier landing aids, and advanced arresting gear brought a new layer of precision. But the fundamentals remained untouched. The pilot still aligned with the offset deck. The LSO still watched the glide path through binoculars. The hook still struck steel. The ritual endured because it worked. Around the world, other nations followed the same path. Britain's new Invincible-class carriers, France's Charles de Gaulle, and later Japan's and India's flat-tops all bore the legacy of that angled concept. Even nations that once stood as adversaries during the Cold War adopted it, acknowledging through design what words could never express: respect for an idea that had saved countless lives. For the people who had lived through World War II, these decades of progress were not abstract. They had seen the world transform from the smoke of propeller warplanes to the silent hum of jet fighters guided by computers. They had witnessed humanity rise from destruction to mastery. When they watched footage of modern carrier landings, they saw not machines but continuity, the same courage, the same resolve, reshaped by time. Many of them were old now, their hands trembling as they saluted the passing ships on television or during port visits. They could still feel the heat of the Pacific sun, the deck shuddering beneath their boots, the smell of cordite and salt. And when they saw a young pilot trapped cleanly on an angled deck, they felt that their generation's sacrifices had not been in vain. The Navy, aware of this heritage, began preserving the story in documentaries and training films. The narrative was always the same: from chaos to order, from danger to discipline, from loss to learning. The idea that men had once landed backwards to save their lives became a metaphor for the entire spirit of naval aviation, the willingness to question old assumptions, to turn tradition on its head in pursuit of survival. During the early 2000s, as carriers supported operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, the cycle continued uninterrupted. The angled deck allowed simultaneous strike and recovery missions, enabling near-constant air support over landlocked terrain thousands of miles from any coastline. The very geometry of the deck shaped the tempo of global warfare. Below decks, engineers monitored systems that had roots stretching back half a century. Arresting gear tension, catapult steam pressure, deck motion sensors. Each parameter tuned to perfection. It was hard to imagine that all of it, every metric of precision, had once been born from chalk lines and experiments on a post-war British ship. For the pilots who trained at Naval Air Station Oceana or Lemoore, the angled deck was no longer new, it was sacred. They studied its history not out of nostalgia but out of gratitude. In every classroom, on every flight simulator, the names of those early innovators appeared like signatures on a covenant between generations. When they deployed, carrying that knowledge into the vastness of the sea, they carried with them the spirit of all who had come before. Every successful landing was both an act of defiance and remembrance. Defiance of the sea's chaos, remembrance of the men who had faced it without such tools. And yet, even as technology marched forward, the essence remained human. A pilot approaching a carrier at night still felt the same surge of adrenaline, the same whisper of fear. He still checked the meatball, adjusted power, aligned his nose with the angled deck, and trusted a system built on decades of lives and lessons. That trust was the quiet inheritance of history. In the hangars, between missions, some of the older maintenance chiefs would tell stories. They had served alongside men whose fathers fought at Midway or Okinawa. They would speak of the days when a landing could tear a ship apart. The young crew would listen in silence, surrounded by jets worth millions of dollars, realizing that the deck beneath them was more than steel, it was a memorial in motion. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the angled deck stood as proof that progress could be measured not in speed or firepower, but in wisdom. It showed that sometimes the smallest change in perspective, a literal shift in angle, could alter the fate of thousands. It was a triumph not only of engineering but of empathy, men learning from the cost of their own bravery. And for those who had lived through the Second World War, who had watched the flames of Midway, the kamikaze strikes, the wreckage of carriers burning in the Pacific, seeing the precision of a modern carrier approach was like seeing peace restored to the sea. It was the same ocean but a different humanity. By the dawn of the 21st century, the sea had not changed, but humanity's understanding of it had. The angled deck, once an experiment drawn in chalk and tested on trembling steel, had become an immortal principle of design. Every new carrier launched from Newport News, every ship sailing under Allied flags, bore that same slanted flight path, invisible yet essential, like a signature written across time. The Navy had entered a new era, digital, networked, autonomous, yet it still relied on the same simple geometry that had once saved so many lives. From the thunder of propeller-driven Avengers to the whispering precision of F/A-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning IIs, the art of carrier landing remained a conversation between man and motion, courage and calculation. The sea still demanded humility, and the angled deck still offered grace. In 2013, the world witnessed a new chapter when an unmanned aircraft, the X-47B, made its first arrested landing on a U.S. Navy carrier. Cameras captured the moment from every angle, the drone gliding silently toward the angled deck, tailhook extended, engines humming in perfect control. When it caught the wire and came to a stop, there was applause on every deck level. Engineers, sailors, and old veterans watching the broadcast felt the same rush of awe. For the first time, a machine had performed the ritual that generations of humans had perfected, and it had done so upon the same tilted geometry that began more than half a century before. The symbolism was profound. The angled deck was not just a feature of steel, it was a statement of continuity. Even as artificial intelligence guided flight paths and sensors replaced human sight, the shape of the landing zone remained the same, a tribute to the men who had once risked everything to discover it. Progress, it seemed, did not erase history, it preserved it. Each landing, whether made by a pilot or a program, carried the same lineage. The same 3 degrees of glide, the same deck offset, the same embrace of physics and bravery. It was a legacy of human intellect forged from the lessons of danger, a geometry of survival written in the language of the sea. For those who had lived through the Second World War, who had seen the first carriers blaze in battle and vanish beneath the waves, this future was almost unrecognizable. Yet when they watched the new generation at work, the quiet confidence of pilots in digital cockpits, the precision of recovery crews illuminated by the glow of screens, they felt something eternal. The courage was the same. The mission was the same. The sea was the same. Only the tools had changed. In museums, children stared at scale models of old carriers, straight-deck relics that once ruled the Pacific. Next to them stood gleaming replicas of modern ships, their decks angled and their markings sharp. Veterans, leaning on canes, would explain the difference softly. "That's what saved them," they'd say. "That little turn right there. That's what made it possible." And the children would nod, not realizing that those few degrees of steel held half a century of lives within them. In the archives of naval history, the angled deck stands as one of those rare inventions that changed everything quietly. It did not roar into existence. It did not announce itself in fanfare. It arrived as an idea, humble and practical, and it endured because it worked. It turned chaos into rhythm, chance into procedure, death into survivability. Today, on the decks of carriers sailing through calm and storm alike, the legacy continues. The pilots of the 21st century train in simulators that replicate every vibration, every wave, every whisper of wind that once tested their predecessors. They learn to align with the offset deck, to trust the geometry, to feel the invisible thread connecting them to those who came before. The sound of the tailhook catching the wire, the sudden deceleration, the roar of engines at idle, it all remains a ritual, unchanged in its essence. 1,000 years from now, if ships still sail and humans still dare to land upon them, that ritual will continue. Because the angled deck is not just about landing, it is about humanity's refusal to surrender to uncertainty. It is the story of men who looked at danger and said, "We can do better." It is the story of engineers who refused to accept fate as final. It is the story of courage refined into precision. And for those who survived the great wars, who saw the oceans aflame and then saw them calm again, it is proof that mankind's greatest strength is not its power, but its capacity to learn. The sea once swallowed the reckless, now it welcomes the prepared. The sky once punished ambition, now it rewards understanding. The angled deck became the bridge between those two realms, a testament that even in war, wisdom can triumph over fear. Every takeoff, every landing, every spark of steel on steel carries that truth forward. It is the echo of every pilot who came home, of every engineer who dared to redraw the lines, of every veteran who stood on the pier and saluted as the next generation took flight. The ocean is eternal, but so is progress. And somewhere, deep in the hum of turbines and the rhythm of the waves, you can still hear it, the sound of men landing backwards into history and forward into the future. If you listened to this story and felt even a spark of awe for those who made it possible, subscribe to the channel, because history like this deserves to live on.